Okay, in this video, we're going to be looking at Australia's temporary migration program. So not people that migrate to Australia and become Australian citizens, but people that come here and work for a short space of time. So first thing we're going to look at is this thing called enterprise migration agreements, which started with the 457 visa. So in 2011, the government introduced this thing called the EMA, which is a enterprise migration agreement. And basically the idea was to address skill shortages and capacity constraints, particularly in the mining sector. And basically what they did is they allowed foreign skilled workers to come here for up to 4 years when there was no local workers available in certain industries. So these enterprise migration agreements are custom programs designed to allow Australian companies to source overseas labour on a temporary basis, but only when genuine skill vacancies exist. Okay? And they can't be filled by Australian labour markets. So that's really important that they're employer sponsored. So they're paid for by by employers in Australia or bosses, and they can only do so when there's legitimate skill shortages, when there's no Australians that are able to fulfil that job. So 457 visas are separate from the permanent migration program and that we've already talked about. They are uncapped, which means there's no limit. Okay, they're totally driven by the needs of the labour market, and as long as you can prove that there's no skill shortages in that area, then you can basically hire as many as you want to fill up those skill shortages. Overseas workers on 457 visas must be paid the Australian market salary rate. Okay, that's really important. Basically, what that means is they have to be paid the same as Australian workers would get paid in that industry. Okay, which doesn't mean it's the minimum wage. It means whatever the market rate is in that industry. So for a doctor, for example, whatever the market rate, whatever Australian doctors get paid, then the people here on the 457 visa have to be paid as well. And they have to be approved by the sponsor. Other things that occur with these 457 visas is that you have to undertake labour market testing, which basically means you have to be able to prove that there's not an existing Australian worker that could have done that job. So it has to be approved that labour market testing occurred, and they have to be able to prove that they've tried to fill the skill shortage with local labour, and that's not possible. So they've advertised, they have provided the dates of advertising, they provide the information about applicants for that position. So there's lots of information about how they tried to source Australian workers, and they were not able to find people with the appropriate skills. Section 457 visas they're designed to help reduce capacity constraints or skill shortages and try and reduce wage pressures and keep unemployment down. So they're generally used in areas where we had higher skill shortages like mining, chefs, accountants, and basically they had to have English language requirements, there had to be legitimate skill shortages, and they had to have the skills to work in that industry, even though it wasn't always the case that they did. As I said, there's no cap, they're unlimited, so it's totally unregulated. The problem was that many businesses were ordered this system, which we'll talk about in a second. So they were designed for areas of skill shortages for like nurses, software programmers, cooks. These are some of the main industries, engineers, accountants. In the past, back in 11, 12, these were some of our main areas of skill shortages. The problem was that many businesses rorted the system, and there were sort of two ways in which they rorted the system. The first one was that they would get people in and then pay them below market rates. So there was a lot of instances where people on 457 visas were getting paid significantly less than they should have been, and not getting paid what existing Australian workers would get paid. In other instances, people were hiring people without doing legitimate labour market testing. So they were hiring people from overseas, and there wasn't legitimate skill shortages in those industries. So that would include like cooks and hotels and restaurants. So not due to a shortage of workers, but in an effort to reduce their cost of production by sourcing cheap foreign labour. So to sum up, basically the two main ways in which they were rorted was one, that they were paying them below the rate they should have been, below the market rate, and two, they were hiring when there was no legitimate skill shortages. There were other instances where there were people coming over that lacked the appropriate skills. You may remember 7-Eleven getting into a lot of trouble for rorting the system and basically paying people a lot less than what they should have. So rorting of the system involves paying 457 visa holders below market wages in order to reduce their cost of production and boost international competitiveness, or not necessarily international, but local competitiveness. This has negative impact on living standards, not only for them because their pay and conditions are lower, but it can also reduce the pay and conditions of existing workers because there's now more competition for jobs and it's harder for them to demand higher wages. People were also hired on 457 visas when there wasn't legitimate skill shortages, and that led to Australians becoming structurally unemployed because they were there, they wanted to work in the industry, but the industry decided to choose these people instead of them because they were cheaper. So there was an inquiry in 2016 And basically, they found out that there was a lot of replacement of local workers by 457 visa holders. That they wanted, as part of the inquiry, they made it clear that labour market testing should be done. And there was another requirement that for every 457 visa holder, that an Australian tertiary education graduate must be employed for a one-on-one basis. So for every foreign worker they got, they needed to have a suitable Australian worker on a one-for-one basis. And that was designed to protect Australia's workers' rights as well. And basically, in April 2017, they were replaced. So we got rid of the 457 visas because of all the rorting that was occurring, because they weren't paying them the right rates, because there was they weren't training. So because they were hiring people when there wasn't legitimate skill shortages. And one other thing, and this is something that's really important when you're linking it to unemployment, is that even if there was legitimate skill shortages, these 457 visas were reducing the incentive to train local workers. So even when there was legitimate skill shortages, the argument was they were still bad for Australian workers because there was no need to train Australian workers because you could just get a quick term fix by getting these people in on the 457 visas. So what they did is they replaced them with this thing called the temporary skills visa. And basically, this temporary skill visa had a lot more stricter conditions associated with it. So rather than being for 4 years, they limited it to 2 for most of these visas. There was no path to permanent residency, which meant it made it a lot harder for these people to become permanent migrants after their 457 visas ran out. And they reduced the amount of eligible occupations on this list by about 200. Some people argue that the temporary skilled visa is not doing enough to solve some of the problems, but they were some of the main changes. Harder to get permanent residency, lower amount of years, and less eligible occupation. So in terms of the switch to the temporary visa, in the 17-18 budget, the government announced new levies on businesses employing foreign workers. So the first change that occurred as part of this new temporary skilled visa is you'd now have to pay a fee every time you got a foreign worker, which would go directly towards this thing called a Skilling Australians Fund, which was designed to provide training and help for local apprenticeships. So the TSS, the temporary skilled visa, allowed foreign skilled workers to work in Australia for up to 2 years, or 4 years. There was still a 4-year term, a medium-term stream, provided businesses can't find Australian workers. So they cracked down on this idea of labour market testing to make sure there was genuine skill shortages and they weren't rorting the system. There were 200 fewer occupations on the list, and as I said before, there's no path to permanent residency, so it was a lot harder for them to become permanent Australians on this temporary skilled visa. In terms of the levy, so every time you hired a foreign worker on this temporary skilled visa, they had to pay between $1,200 to $1,800 for a temporary work visa and up to $5,000 for those on the medium-term skilled visa. So basically, they wanted to make sure that every time that they were hiring someone, they genuinely needed them, and that every time we hired someone from overseas, it was contributing towards boosting the skills of Australians. As I said, one of the main problems was there was a lack of incentive to train up Australian workers. So the levy that contributed to this $1.2 billion fund was making it clear that that's a priority. Training Australian workers is the main priority, not just getting in a quick fix. The temporary skilled visa aims to reduce capacity constraints, but it does so without rorting the system. Other things that is required by this temporary skilled visa, they had to have good English language skills, they couldn't have a criminal record, and as I said to you before, there was mandatory labour market testing, which means you had to test to see if there was appropriate Australian workers first. The temporary skilled visa aims to reduce capacity constraints. I've talked about this. One of the weaknesses is technically they can lead to lower wage growth because there's more competition, but that was less of an issue with this visa. So the aim of the scheme was to reduce capacity constraints and costs for businesses and boost our productive capacity, also restrain wage growth, but hopefully ensuring that unemployment doesn't increase. A lot of people claimed it was similar to the old scheme, and it still provided less incentive to train Australian local workers. There's more incentive now because you've got the fund, and you had to pay a levy every time that you got someone from overseas, but potentially less incentive still compared to no temporary visa. So to summarise, the benefits of the 457 visa, it solved a lot of skill shortages, helped to reduce wage pressures, it increased access to highly skilled workers from overseas, but the issue were that people were rorting the system and paying them too little, and also getting people in when there wasn't legitimate skill shortages. It also meant there was less incentive to hire Australian workers. In terms of the temporary skilled visa, that provided tougher labour market testing, so to make sure that companies were ensuring there wasn't appropriate Australians. There's less chance of them staying for a long period of time. The argument is with less visas, there might be slightly higher wages because there's slightly less competition than when a lot more people are coming in. So there could still be skill shortages, and some people stated that labour market testing still won't take place. So a couple of questions. Discuss how rorting of the Section 457 visas can have an effect on living standards. Basically, rorting the system can mean they get paid below market wages in order to reduce real unit labour costs. This can have negative effects for living standards, as it can reduce the pay and conditions for existing workers. Hiring people on 457 visas when there's no genuine skill shortages can also lead to structural unemployment, making it harder for Australians to find work and therefore afford basic goods and services. So the rorting has two problems. It generally leads to lower wages, but it can also make it harder for Australians to find work if they're not doing genuine labour market testing. Define an EMA and discuss how that provides a trade-off between efficiency and equity. Less likely to get this question, but defining an EMA, it's a program that allows Australian companies to source overseas workers for a short period of time, assuming they can't fill the vacancy themselves. They allow businesses to avoid skill shortages and help to reduce, but they can increase structural unemployment. They help to keep labour markets loose and put downward pressure on real unit labour costs. They should also boost productivity. That helps to increase output per unit of input, which boosts technical efficiency. But if they're being used when there's not genuine skill shortages, that can lead to more people living in absolute poverty because Australians can't find access to work, and that's bad for equity. And lastly, explain how they help to alleviate skill shortages. Well, basically, they're part of the Enterprise Migration Agreement, and they allow businesses to hire skilled workers on a temporary basis where there are skill shortages. Workers are hired in their professions. It helps to boost the supply of labour. This reduces pressure on wages as skill shortages are less prevalent, and it puts pressure on existing workers to work harder. Despite not being able to pay workers below market rates, the increased skills and knowledge help to increase productivity and reduce real unit labour costs. Thank you.